As was mentioned, my name is Paul Scudo, and I am in recovery from the disease of addiction as well. I came from that family that Dr. Thurstone described. Perfect parenting, no use, no abuse, all of the opportunities available to me, and yet still I ended up suffering from the disease of addiction. Many of us begin using drugs and alcohol simply because we like the way it feels, and because it is a social catalyst between the other, friends in our peer group. And by and large, that's how most of us get started, right? I say that to then say that addiction took everything away from me. I lost everything: a wife, a great job, a home, and ended up being homeless for a number of years. And I say that so that I qualify as someone that is suffering from what many of you or your loved ones are dealing with. As Peter mentioned, I now work as the executive director of STEP Denver Men's Residential Recovery Community. We work helping low-income men to overcome the consequences of addiction through a program that's focused on sobriety, work, and accountability. What we're looking to do is effect a behavioral change by establishing a foundation in addiction recovery, having those individuals become personally responsible for themselves, having them develop themselves in the 8 different areas of wellness, and then having them to become responsible, personally responsible, and accountable for their behaviors, right? We're looking to effect a behavioral change. As was mentioned, addiction is a disease. And the unique thing about this disease is the primary symptom of the disease is that it tells you that you do not have a disease, right? And it tells you that because of the stigma that's associated with the disease of addiction, right? It's embarrassing, it's humiliating. I don't want to be looked at as someone with no willpower, or that I am unethical or immoral, or I make bad choices, or that I'm just a bad person, right? So instinctively, I'm going to tell myself that I don't have a problem and that I can control this. There's also the stigma that surrounds the disease within the community. 90% of the people do not suffer from the disease of addiction and can use drugs or alcohol recreationally. And while that's a completely foreign idea to someone like me, it is the case for most individuals. And thus they say, hey, Paul, your life is a mess. Why don't you just stop? And they don't understand the chemical reaction that's going on in my brain. And as Dr. Thurstone said, if you want to get with us on the chemistry of that, we'll take off his bow tie and connect the dots. Right? Loved ones also suffer from this disease. Right? None of us want to say that we were a bad parent, that we didn't support our loved ones. Right? We are genetically wired and programmed to take care of our family, particularly our children, at all costs. Right? So I am going to, in many cases, make bad choices. Right? It's difficult as a parent to make some difficult choices. Right? And no one can tell you what you should or should not do. That is up to you as a parent. At STEP Denver, we deal with men 21 years of age and older. They've usually gone through the resources that Kent and Christian have talked about. They've tried the top 10 for parenting, and for some reason or another, treatment or other resources just have not worked with the loved one. And that loved one has gone out and they've gotten to the point where the consequences are severe enough. Our experience shows that in the majority of the cases, an individual will not seek recovery or a solution until those consequences have become severe enough that there is no hiding them anymore, and also that the folks around them are not supporting the fact that it might be something other than addiction, our quick go-to is mental health, depression, anxiety, things of that nature. And while there are many co-occurring situations, I'm not going to argue that situation, oftentimes there is a misdiagnosis in which the anxiety, depression, and manic depressive symptoms are caused by the addiction and the chemical process going on. But it's very easy for me as a parent to say, oh, my child's depressed, right? That's a much more societally acceptable reason for them using drugs and alcohol, right? Our experience also shows that if an addict is repeatedly rescued from those consequences or is allowed for there to be other reasons for their use, they're going to continue that cycle until the loved one says, or the rest of their peers say, you know what, I think you need to seek help for your addiction. Until everyone is on the same page with the fact that the individual has a problem and that we are not going to rescue or enable or supply the means by which that cycle can continue, the individual is more than likely going to continue to use. And that's difficult because oftentimes an addict will pit the family against each other, right? One parent wants to continue to give, continue to accept, continue that compassionate side that Dr. Thurstone talked about, and the other parent is going to want to move towards the authoritarian or authoritative side and say, no, we're cutting you off, no more resources, and oftentimes there is conflict within the home. And the addict knows how to play that, and oftentimes will play that relationship. Experiences, including my own, show until I'm cut off from those resources, and once I am, the consequences will pile up more quickly. And I will ultimately get to the point where I want recovery in a more timely fashion than I would if I was enabled or those resources continue. And again, this is extremely difficult. How do I just cut off my loved one? And again, this is after you've tried all of the other resources, right? This is where you've been compassionate. You have tried to work with the individual, and those things just aren't happening. How do you cut that person off? It's so difficult, whether it's a child, a wife, a husband, a brother or a sister, a good friend, a coworker, someone that you're emotionally invested in. It is very difficult to say, hey, I love you, and because I love you, I have to stop for your own well-being. That's alien to our psyche. So we just, and I think it was in the same study that Kristen talked about, I heard a woman speak at the Smart Colorado luncheon, and she talked about a story in which she and her husband were at odds with how to take care of their daughter that was addicted to prescription drugs. And the husband wanted to continue to supply her living, continue to give her an apartment and an allowance and bail her out of jail, and the mother wanted to cut her off. And they ultimately got divorced because of that. And unfortunately, that young girl unfortunately died because of that, because there wasn't the utter despair that comes along with, as Peter described, step one, where I admit that I am completely powerless, I cannot hide this anymore, no one is going to take care of me, and my life has become completely unmanageable. And when I get to that point, I often then will have a psychic and a spiritual shift which will allow me to become willing to do whatever is suggested. So how can you help, right? To get the addict the help they need, and not just bailed out of consequences. So many times I told my family, oh yeah, I'm ready for help, because there was jail, or the loss of my wife, loss of my home, loss of a job. There was a consequence associated with it. I didn't really want the help other than to stay out of trouble, right? But if they are ready, if they've lost everything, and you can tell that they are genuine, get them into a 30 to 90-day treatment program. And then they need long-term extended sober living, and a sober living that has some type of accountability to it, right? Where they have to work full-time, they're getting drug tested, they have to be part of a peer recovery community like the 12 steps or other. They have to have dialogue with the family to rebuild those relationships. And they don't need to do anything else. Provide nothing else for them. Let them work and earn their own living. Most sober livings, you could live in an Oxford house for $500-600 a month. There are concerned citizens that are right here that run sober living homes at a reasonable cost. You don't need to send them to a $5,000 or $10,000 a month sober living. That's unrealistic. It's too expensive. And oftentimes you're putting them in a situation that's really too nice for where they need to be. Also, do not believe anything that they say. Only believe what they do. Right? And let me step back real quickly. If they are ready for help, there can be no stipulations to the help. Right? If they are resistant in any way to what you suggest, they're not ready. If there are conditions, they're not ready. If there's negotiation, they're not ready, right? If they are ready, then begin. And have them do it the way you want them to do it, not what they think they should do. It's obvious they're not in the right mental state of mind to make decisions about what's healthy. And then again, I go back to, in that first year, 2 years of recovery, don't listen to anything they say. Only observe what they do. For many, many years, we as addicts have manipulated the situation. We've told you what you wanted to hear. We've apologized over and over again. We have done whatever it has taken to be able to maintain our use and continue the cycle of addiction, right? But actions will ultimately speak louder than words. Most importantly, seek your own personal counseling and support groups. This affects the family and the loved ones sometimes in a much more devastating manner than it does the individual suffering from the disease of addiction. You need to be able to counsel with others that are going through the same experience that you are. Just like we as addicts need to counsel with other addicts that are going through recovery, you need to get professional clinical help around certain issues that you're dealing with from a parental or a marital standpoint. It's extremely important that if you want to come out of this healthy, whether or not your loved one does, that you need to find your own help. So often we're like, it's them, right? And as the rescuer, that makes it great for me, right? I'm okay. Lex has the problem, right? So I naturally go into that facilitator, rescuer, fixer mode. And during that time, I'm suffering my own mental issues. So I highly recommend that you seek your own professional help. There is hope. There is a solution. Recovery from addiction is taking place every day. Millions of us are doing this, right? What we're not doing is we're not saying, yeah, I'll get into recovery if I can do it this way, if you give me this, if I'm allowed to do that. No, there is a very clear solution, and those of us that are in the solution do what we're told. Again, I go back to, if there's any negotiation, that person's not in recovery. That person's not ready. Those are controversial statements. You're going to hear many people tell you, well, we need to meet them where they're at. And we need to be able to be compassionate. And there are many pathways to recovery. And while there are, and many of them are a good start, I agree with Dr. Thurstone. MAT, medically assisted treatment or therapy, is a great start if there is a horizon. I have a daughter that was on methadone for 12 years and it did nothing because she did not work a program of recovery in conjunction with that. So it is a great way to wean an individual off of a substance as you build a recovery program. Anyone that tells you this person needs, with all due respect, anyone that suggests that an individual needs to be on medically assisted treatment, and this is only my opinion, for their lifetime, I would question that. I personally would question that because once an individual truly gets into recovery, they want to break free of whatever the addiction is, whether it's substance or process, whether it's cigarettes, caffeine, sex, drugs. Once you understand addiction and you enter into recovery from that, you do not want to be addicted or dependent on something else. And there is a solution with very strong recovery communities in our community. Let me be redundant. And there are many organizations that provide peer recovery support resources, coaching, and then the 12-step process. And then there are secular peer groups too. I believe in the spiritual peer group, but for those, if you have a loved one that just can't grasp that yet, get them into some sort of peer recovery community, because only together can we overcome what individually we were unable to. Thanks so much.